The Sunday school lessons for December 29th, 2024 are David's Son and a Cry for Help. Luke chapter 18, verses 35 through 43. Welcome, viewers and subscribers to my channel, Read With Me. I am Audrey. If you are new here, please know that this is an audio reading of the lesson with intermittent commentary. In order to keep this video in the YouTube algorithm, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Verses 35 through 37. As Jesus approached Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard the crowd going by, he asked what was happening. They told him, Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. In verse 35, located near the Jordan River, about 17 miles east of Jerusalem, the city of Jericho is infamous for having been destroyed by God some 14 centuries prior to the encounter described in Luke chapter 18 or Joshua 6. Archaeology reveals that there were actually two locations for Jericho in the first century. The ancient location, as described in the Old Testament, and the complex rebuilt by Herod, approximately 1 mile from the more ancient location. The modern city of Jericho includes both sites. The parallel account in the Gospel of Mark reveals more of the identity of this certain blind man. Mark chapter 10, verse 46 tells us that he is Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus. The fact that Luke doesn't give the name is a bit surprising, given his tendency to give more actual names relative to how frequently the other three Gospels do so. The non-inclusion of the man's name here may be due to the fact that Luke was not an eyewitness, Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, but ultimately this is speculation. For a person living in the first century AD, any degree of visual impairment was untreatable. Corrective lenses, as we have them today, would not be available for centuries to come. The most serious visual impairment is, of course, blindness. People who were so afflicted had few, if any, viable treatment options and were unable to work in many occupations. Begging alongside heavily traveled roads or next to city gates was frequent. The law of Moses pronounced a curse on those who took advantage of the blind. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 14, and Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 18. The exact makeup and number of the crowd is not given. In Luke chapter 12, verse 1, we see the description of a crowd of many thousands had gathered, so they were trampling on one another. This crowd, undoubtedly with dropouts and add-ins along the way, was tagging along with Jesus on his final journey to Jerusalem. It was not unusual for people to travel long distances in large groups. Bandits would frequently wait along roads to ambush solitary travelers. While the Roman road system and garrisons have made travel safer, banditry was still exceedingly common. Indeed, the parable of the Good Samaritan actually begins with this common scenario. Its setting is the same road between Jericho and Jerusalem on which Jesus and his companions traveled. Luke chapter 10, verse 30. A crowd of people naturally generates a great deal of noise, especially when enthusiastic about something. This occurrence is what catches the attention of the man who was blind. In verse 37, the designation of Jesus being of Nazareth or as a Nazarene occurs about 24 times in the New Testament, all in the four Gospels and Acts. Although Jesus was not born in Nazareth, he grew up there. Luke chapter 2, verse 39, chapter 4, verse 16, and verses 23 through 24. Also, Matthew chapter 2, verse 23. As a variant of the name Joshua, the name Jesus might have been common at that time. But there was no other person who had worked miraculously among the people, no other person who could be recognized by such a designation as evidenced by the next verse. Verses 38 through 39. He called out, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. Those who led the way rebuked him and told him to be quiet. But he shouted all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. The designation of Jesus as the Son of David reveals something that the blind man can see, in contrast to the spiritually blind religious leaders. Matthew chapter 22, verses 41 through 46. Since the Messiah was to come from the line of David, 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 12 through 16, Psalm 89, verses 3 through 4, Isaiah 11, verse 1, Jeremiah 23, verses 5 through 6, 33, verses 17 through 22. He was also referred to as the Son of David, Luke chapter 20, verses 41 through 44. Jesus was a descendant of David because he was Joseph's adopted son, as Luke established earlier in his gospel, Luke chapter 3, verses 23 through 38. By calling Jesus the Son of David, the blind man showed that he recognized Jesus as the Messiah of Israel. But even such recognition did not guarantee a complete understanding of the Messiah's role. Luke chapter 24, verses 19 through 27, Acts chapter 1, verse 6. It is no coincidence that Luke relates Jesus' prediction of his own death and resurrection to his 12 disciples just before this encounter with the blind man, Luke chapter 18, verses 31 through 34. The disciples, too, had acknowledged Jesus as they traveled with and learned from Jesus for 3 years. Still, when Jesus warned them that he would die soon and rise again according to the scriptures, they did not understand him. On the other hand, the blind man did not know Jesus. In fact, he could not even see Jesus. Yet he possessed the spiritual sight to recognize that Jesus truly was the Messiah, the promised Messiah of Israel. We should note that the Hebrew word Messiah and the Greek word Christ mean the same thing, the anointed one. John chapter 1, verse 41, and chapter 4, verse 25. Those who led the way rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. The crowd attempted to quiet the blind man. Luke does not explain their reasons, but it may have to do with the way that important people were treated in the ancient world. Most people believe that those individuals who were important and famous stood above common people's concerns. The group may have thought they were paying Jesus due honor and respect by keeping someone they considered unimportant from bothering them. The blind man, however, showed no concern for such a social norm. Indeed, he shouted all the more as he called again for Jesus' mercy. Like the widow who pestered the judge in search of justice, Luke chapter 18, verses 1 through 8, the blind man ignored barriers in his way and persisted in asking Jesus for help. Verses 40 through 41. Jesus stopped and ordered the man to be brought to him. When he came near, Jesus asked him, What do you want me to do for you? Lord, I want to see, he replied. Based on ancient ideas of honor and the value of persons, the blind man had very little worth. Thus, it is likely that the crowd didn't expect this reaction by Jesus, but Jesus was an expert at subverting expectations. At the outset, we should realize that Jesus doesn't ask this question to correct an information deficit, to learn something that he doesn't know. He already knows what the man needs. One legitimate reason for the question is that Jesus wanted everyone present to hear the specifics of the man's request. The recovery of sight would have been a very impressive miracle, and Jesus could have wanted his audience to recognize the full impact of what was taking place. A second possible reason for Jesus' question is that Jesus may have wanted the blind man to demonstrate faith. By stating the great problem that he had, the blind man risked embarrassment for even asking for something so bold. Verses 42 through 43. Jesus said to him, "Receive your sight. Your faith has healed you." Immediately, he received his sight and followed Jesus, praising God. When all the people saw it, they also praised God. Christians have been reading this story for nearly 2,000 years, and the radical nature of this healing is less clear to us than it would have been to the original readers. There were many people in the first century who claimed to have the power to heal. Frequently, they depended on calling for the help of higher spiritual forces. Many in the ancient world believed that healing various ailments required connecting with spiritual beings. These beings held special positions in the cosmic hierarchy. To get help from these beings, one would have to know their names and perform elaborate rituals to lure them. In other words, many saw healing as a kind of magic that only being higher up the celestial hierarchy could accomplish. In contrast, Jesus did not summon such beings for help. He didn't ask for a heavenly creature to heal the blind man. He didn't perform any special rituals or even touch the person. Instead, Jesus simply commanded that the man receive sight. Unlike ancient exorcists, Jesus had the power to heal others. He merely spoke, and the blind man was healed. In so doing, Jesus demonstrated power over human bodies that only the creator of those bodies could possess. It may be tempting to understand the man's faith as saving faith, the admission of one's guilt for sins and request for God to be forgiven. But there is no mention of sin in this passage. Jesus does not claim that the man's sins have been forgiven. Mark chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. Instead, faith in this context likely refers to two related aspects of the blind man's actions. First, he rightly identified Jesus as the expected son of David. Second, and most important, he persisted in his request when everyone around him pressured him to be silent. The man rejected the pressure of the crowd and focused only on who Jesus is and what Jesus can do. He continued to ask for healing, even when everyone around him wanted him to stop. The man's persistence thus showed his faith in Jesus and his trust in the Messiah's love, compassion, and power. The power of Jesus is further shown by the speed with which the healing occurs. Jesus simply spoke the word, and immediately the blind man received his sight. Unlike supposed healers among the Greeks and Romans, Jesus' commands has instantaneous results. The particular Greek word being translated immediately is a favorite of Luke's. Chapter 16 of the words, 18 occurrences in the New Testament occur in his gospel and book of Acts. This result is interesting to contrast with the healing outcome in Luke chapter 8, verses 38 through 39. In that earlier passage, a healed man wanted to accompany Jesus but was refused. We see no such refusal in the passage at hand, however. The difference is attributable to the shifting context of Jesus' ministry. The episode in Luke 8 occurred outside the traditional boundaries of Israelite territory, and the timing wasn't right for Gentile outreach. The context in our lesson passage is different. Jesus is on his final trip to Jerusalem. There were likely no drawbacks for one more person to join the crowd. The shock wave of the healing sent ripples across all the people, and we can't help but wonder if those who praised God were the same ones who had tried to silence the blind man just a few minutes earlier. This ending also sets up a surprise for the reader. One would expect that someone as powerful as Jesus would have continual victories wherever he goes. That impression is supported in the next chapter as Jesus brings Zacchaeus, the tax collector, to repentance. Luke chapter 19, verses 1 through 10. And as Jesus enters Jerusalem with a crowd of people who call him King, chapter 19, verse 38. Yet Jesus had warned his disciples more than once that he would have to die and rise again. The reader is thus primed to experience the shock of Jesus' death and the joy of his resurrection that follows. Thank you so much for watching. Join me soon for the next audio reading of the Sunday School lesson with intermittent commentary. Stay safe and may God bless.